Around 9:30 a.m. on June 16, 2010, a 29-year-old woman named Linnell Barsock lay in bed in her house in Palmdale, California. It was a Wednesday, and Linnell had the day off from her job at a health center in Los Angeles. But she didn't really have time to relax, because she was also a college student. She was working on becoming a registered nurse, and she knew she had to get up and go study. But she just didn't feel like it. Plus, she could hear her boyfriend Lewis moving around in the kitchen downstairs, and just knowing Lewis was down there was another reason to stay put. So Linnell and Lewis had been together for about 4 years. They'd met in college and immediately hit it off. Now, they own this house together, a 5-bedroom home that they had scraped together all their savings to make a down payment on. At the beginning of their relationship, Linnell and Lewis had been completely in love and on the same page about building a life together. But over time, Lewis had become this incredibly jealous and possessive person that was just really volatile, and it really just kind of scared Linnell and was beginning to drive her away. And then, just a few months ago, they'd gotten into this huge screaming fight when he had heard her talking to another guy on the phone. That fight had gotten so bad that she had tried to drive away, but Lewis had literally chased her in his truck, which led to both of them crashing. Even now, as she laid in bed months later, Linnell still felt traumatized by that whole thing. They had eventually made up, but it was hard to look at Lewis in the same way. It was like she couldn't see a future with him anymore. All she saw now was this volatile, controlling guy. And so lately, Linnell was seriously considering ending things with him. But just then, Linnell's phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her friend Lorraine asking if she was up. And as soon as she saw it, Linnell just kind of sighed because she actually had forgotten that she had plans with Lorraine, who had offered to do Linnell's hair that day. So, resigned, she texted Lorraine to come on over. Then Linnell got out of bed. About 30 minutes later, Linnell sat on a bar stool and ate breakfast at the kitchen island with Lewis. The stools were actually some of the only furniture in the whole house. It had already been a year since they'd moved in, but Linnell so far had not had time to decorate. As she ate, Linnell tried to keep her chit-chat with Lewis to a minimum. They'd been fighting so much lately that she didn't want to accidentally start an argument. But Linnell was a naturally bubbly and talkative person, and so just sitting here being quiet was kind of awkward. So she was actually relieved when she heard the front door open and her friend Lorraine walked in. Linnell smiled. Lorraine lived right in Palmdale, and so it was nice for Linnell to have a friend so close by. The rest of Linnell's friends and family were in LA, about an hour and a half away. Lorraine walked over and gave Linnell a hug, and the two of them began talking while Lewis got ready to leave. He was going to have his truck worked on actually by Lorraine's boyfriend, who lived near LA and would do the work for a low price. It was a long drive, but it was worth it for the savings. Lewis ultimately left without even saying goodbye, and then at that point, Lorraine worked on Linnell's hair while Linnell vented about Lewis and how tense things had gotten. And just talking about everything actually made her feel better, even though she had no idea how she was actually going to solve any of these big problems in her relationship. But about an hour later, Linnell suddenly heard tires screech into the driveway outside. Seconds later, Lewis burst into the house looking absolutely furious. He was holding a cell phone above his head and waving it around in the air. And Linnell immediately recognized this phone, because it was her secret phone that she'd actually gotten from her other boyfriend. That guy she'd been talking to on the phone with the day she and Lewis got in that big fight about it that ended with the car crash. Well, the truth was, Lewis had a reason to be upset because she was talking to another guy who she was involved with. It was this other boyfriend. That other boyfriend's name was Ike, and Linnell had met him about 4 months ago on a dating website. Both of them were seeking careers in nursing, and they had a ton in common. Ike was also way calmer, more successful, and more motivated than Lewis. He lived over 300 miles away in Northern California, but whenever he had time off and Lewis wasn't home, he came down to Palmdale to see Linnell. On the day of Linnell and Lewis's huge fight, Linnell had promised Lewis that she would never talk to Ike again. But that had been a lie, and now Lewis had caught her. And so Lewis started yelling, demanding to know if Linnell was still cheating on him, and Linnell felt her heart start racing. The last time Lewis had gotten like this, their fight ended with a literal car crash. She didn't want that to happen again, so she decided the best way to handle this was to just remove herself from this situation. So she just walked over and grabbed the secret phone out of Lewis's hand and then ran out the door with Lorraine while Lewis kept on screaming at her. Linnell and Lorraine jumped into Linnell's car and sped out of the neighborhood. Linnell couldn't stop shaking because she knew Lewis was furious and she didn't really know what was going to happen next. And so she and Lorraine decided that they would just go kill some time by going to a beauty store to get some more products, and hopefully by the time they got home, Lewis would be gone. The two of them got to the store around noon. Linnell and Lorraine went inside, and Linnell walked around the aisles, grabbing products. Her heart was still hammering in her chest, and when she checked out at the counter, she found herself just staring into space, trying her best to, not think about Lewis, but she couldn't help herself. But by the time she actually had her products paid for and put in a bag, she was starting to calm down just a little bit. Then she headed outside with Lorraine. However, as soon as she stepped out of the shop, she gasped, because right there on the sidewalk was Lewis. He was waiting for her. Lewis demanded to know if she was still seeing Ike, and at first, Linnell was just super defensive, like she always was when they fought. But as Lewis continued to rant and accuse her, her head just started to pound, and then suddenly, it was like all of her fear and stress about this relationship just disappeared. This weird sense of calm came over her, and she knew this was it. This was the last straw. She was done, and she just wanted Lewis out of her life. So she exhaled, handed Lewis her second phone, and then just stormed back over to the car with Lorraine. About 15 minutes later, Linnell parked her car in the driveway at home. When she'd gotten into her car and driven away, she'd thought that maybe she had lost Lewis, and she'd hoped that he had just driven somewhere far away to cool down. But apparently, that hadn't happened, because his truck was parked right outside the house, which meant Lewis was inside, waiting for her. Linnell wanted to scream. She glanced at Lorraine, who just reached over and squeezed her hand, trying to give her a bit of encouragement. Then Linnell just took a deep breath. She knew what she was doing with Ike was wrong, but she was sick of all the fights and of Lewis trying to control everything about her. I mean, the relationship had died months ago. She just needed to end it now, officially. She wished she had more time to plan out how to do this, but after today, she felt like she had no choice. She just had to go in there and tell him this was done. So Linnell got out of her car and headed towards the house. Over 6 hours later, around 6:45 p.m., Linnell's friend Lorraine was staring down at her silent cell phone and starting to feel nervous. Linnell hadn't called her after whatever final fight she had had with Lewis, and Lorraine had a bad feeling about the whole thing. She knew that Lewis and Linnell's fights had the possibility of getting completely out of hand. I mean, they had before. So now, Lorraine was back at Linnell's house, just making sure her friend was okay. But as she walked through the living room, she noticed their house was unnaturally quiet. Lewis was not there, and it didn't seem like Linnell was there either. That morning, Lorraine had been afraid, when Lewis was chasing them all around town, and now she was starting to get that same nervous sense that maybe Lewis was nearby, about to spring out at her. But she told herself to just settle down and focus. However, when she passed by the laundry room, she felt this wave of panic so intense come over her that she had to grasp the wall just to steady herself. Because there, on the laundry room floor, was a pile of bloody towels. And then beyond the laundry room, there was a door that led into the garage, and it was partially open. And so Lorraine was very nervous, but still, she felt like she had to investigate, and so she walked over to the door and she pushed it all the way open. Now, it was dark in the garage, so she couldn't see much, and so she just stepped forward, and when she did, she stepped onto this plastic bag that was slick, and it caused her to trip and fall to the ground. And then when she looked at what she had fallen in, she realized it was blood. She stood up as quick as she could and then just stood there staring at the garage like waiting for movement, but there was no one in there. And then as her eyes slowly adjusted, she saw Linnell's car. It had been backed into the garage and was now sitting there with its trunk open, and when she looked at the ground by its back wheels, she saw something sticking out from behind the car. And the longer she stared at it, the more the image clarified. It was a pair of feet. At this point, Lorraine turned and ran. A few minutes later, Lorraine sped into the parking lot at the Palmdale Sheriff's Department. Once she parked, she stumbled out of her car and began running towards the front doors. Once she got inside, she charged up to the employee at the front desk and just started yelling about how there was blood, so much blood, and how she had slipped in it when she tried to find her friend, and her friend was just lying there, and she knew she wasn't making a lot of sense, but it was like it was impossible to think. Finally, though, she was able to calm down enough that she just blurted out, "My friend Linnell was murdered." Later that night, around 11 p.m., two homicide detectives stood in the driveway of Linnell's home, looking up at the two-story house. Their names were Bob Kenny and Joe Espino, and they were veteran detectives who worked together all the time. They'd come all the way from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Homicide Bureau, which meant they'd just driven about an hour and a half to get to Palmdale. But this actually wasn't out of the ordinary. Detective Kenny had been called to Palmdale more than a few times to investigate homicides there. Palmdale had gotten safer in recent years, but the murder rate was still higher than both the state and the national average. But as Kenny looked at his surroundings, this trip to Palmdale felt different. They were in an upscale neighborhood, and the house they were standing in front of looked nice. The detectives walked inside, and right away, Kenny noticed that the front door was undamaged, and a uniformed police officer who was standing in the entryway told them that there were no signs of forced entry at the back door either. Kenny had already been briefed that this home was owned by a 29-year-old woman named Linnell Barsock, who was found dead in her garage by a friend right after what sounded like a pretty intense fight with her boyfriend. Linnell shared the home with that boyfriend, Louis Bonaire, and Louis was nowhere to be found. So to Kenny, this was starting to look like a pretty straightforward case. Romantic partners, especially angry ones, were always the first suspects, and the fact that Louis had apparently taken off made him look even more suspicious. There were already officers out canvassing the neighborhood and calling Louis's friends and family, trying to track him down. The uniformed officer led Kenny and Espino through the house towards the garage. As they walked, Kenny noted the strange emptiness of all the rooms. Some didn't even have furniture in them. But this didn't feel like robbers had come in and removed all the furniture. It just sort of seemed like the house was vacant. And on top of that, there really were no signs of robbery in general. I mean, the TV was there and nothing had been rifled through, but Kenny was more struck by the fact that there was so little to steal in the first place. To get to the garage, the detectives had to pass through a laundry room, and when he stepped inside that area, Detective Kenny saw bloody towels everywhere and smears of blood on the floor. It was immediately obvious that whoever had killed Linnell had tried, and failed, to clean up their mess. When Kenny and Espino stepped into the garage, they found there was a car there that had been backed in and had its trunk open. Next to it on the ground were more bloody towels, along with large plastic sheets, and most of them were shoved to the side and in a big pile. But there was some bloody plastic sheeting that was up by the door to the laundry room where they were standing. Detective Kenny stepped into the garage around the bloody towels to the far side of the car, where he saw a pair of feet on the floor. It was Linnell. Her face was covered by a black plastic bag, and so Detective Kenny knelt down and peeled back the plastic. He found her face and head were covered in blood, and when he tipped her head to the side, he saw the source, a bullet hole right in the back of her skull. He wondered if the killer had wrapped her head in plastic to try to, clean up or contain the blood, or if they had felt some kind of remorse and couldn't bear to look at Linnell's face. Detective Kenny stood and moved over to the trunk of the car. When he looked inside, he saw that it was full of garbage bags, which were packed with bloody sheets and bedding. It looked like the killer must have been trying to put all this evidence into the car and drive away with it, except they hadn't actually done that. Instead, they left the car behind, along with everything else, which just didn't make any sense. Kenny wondered if maybe something like, the arrival of Linnell's friend, Lorraine, had interrupted the killer before they could escape. But just then, a deputy stuck his head in the garage and excitedly told the detectives that they'd just found something. Moments later, Detectives Kenny and Espino were standing in the kitchen. They were leaning over a piece of paper that lay on the floor, right beside a yellow evidence marker the crime scene techs had placed. This piece of paper had messy handwriting on it. Kenny made sure it was photographed before he picked it up with his gloved hand to look closer. It was a letter, signed by Linnell and addressed to Louis, her boyfriend. The letter said she was leaving him for her other boyfriend, Ike. At this, Kenny raised his eyebrows. The missing boyfriend, Louis, was already suspect number one, and this note certainly gave him a motive for murder. But it also gave Kenny a second suspect, this other boyfriend, Ike. Maybe, he thought, this case was going to be more complicated than he first expected. He looked around at the bare kitchen and the empty rooms beyond it, and it looked to him like neither of the people living in the house had actually committed to settling in and staying together. Linnell apparently had one foot out the door already. As he read the note one more time, Kenny wondered what other secrets his victim might have been keeping. Detectives Kenny and Espino were still on scene when a uniformed officer came to tell them that they had gotten a lead on the missing boyfriend, Lewis. Apparently, he had gone to Los Angeles, and he often stayed at Linnell's mom's house when he was there, since the drive back to Palmdale was so long. It was the middle of the night by this point, but that didn't matter. Kenny dispatched an LA police officer to wait outside of Linnell's mother's house as backup, and then he dialed the phone number for Linnell's mom. After a few rings, a woman answered. When Detective Kenny introduced himself, she confirmed she was Linnell's mother, Bobby Barsock. She sounded concerned and asked what was going on, but Kenny didn't tell her. Instead, he needed to speak to Lewis. His decision not to explain himself was strategic. Neither Bobby nor Lewis had been told explicitly that Linnell was dead, and Detective Kenny wanted to hold back that information for as long as possible. When he talked to Lewis, he wanted to see if Lewis would act confused, which would be the natural reaction if you really hadn't done anything, or if he would behave like a guilty person who knew exactly why the police were calling him in the middle of the night. Detective Kenny heard Bobby hand over the phone, and then a man came on the line and said he was Lewis. And right away, Lewis said, "This is about Linnell." When Kenny finished the phone call a few minutes later, he was feeling good, because now he had a definite number one suspect. Lewis had brought up Linnell without being told she was dead, and then he had been surprisingly cooperative when Kenny responded by giving him no information at all and just told him to go outside and get into the squad car in front of the house that's waiting for him. To Kenny, it seemed like Lewis had been waiting for this call, and maybe even feeling guilty. He thought of the plastic that had been pulled over Linnell's face, like whoever had killed her couldn't bear to look at what they had done. After Kenny had told Lewis over the phone to go get into the squad car, he had spoken to Linnell's mom, Bobby Barsock, again. And when he told her that her daughter was dead, Bobby just wailed in anguish into the phone. And then eventually, she told Kenny how controlling and jealous Lewis was, and she said she was coming to the sheriff's department to talk to them too. It would take more than an hour and a half for Lewis and Bobby to get to Palmdale, but that was fine by Kenny. He and his partner still needed to go talk to their first eyewitness, the friend, Lorraine, who had reported the murder in the first place, who was waiting for them at the sheriff's department. Around 6 a.m., Detectives Kenny and Espino walked through the same sheriff's department doors that Lorraine had burst through 11 hours earlier, saying that she had found her friend dead. Lorraine had already told her story to uniformed officers, but Kenny wanted to hear her story directly. He had read her statement, and it was clear that she had been in a state of pure panic when she had first arrived at the department. When Kenny and his partner walked into the interview room and sat down across from Lorraine, Kenny thought she seemed a lot calmer than her statement made her out to be, although she did still have blood on her clothes and looked exhausted and clearly shaken up. He started slowly, with general questions about her relationship to Linnell. Lorraine said they were really good friends, and they hung out a few times a week since they lived so close to each other. Then she went over what had happened the day before, how she'd gone to Linnell's that morning to do her hair, but then Linnell and Lewis had gotten into a big fight, and Lewis, had ended up chasing them all around town. Lorraine said that she and Linnell had gone back to Linnell's house at about 12:30 p.m., and Lewis was there waiting for them. She said that she decided to leave and give the couple some space. Lorraine said the couple's fighting was typical, and that whole relationship honestly was toxic. But this fight in particular did seem worse, because Linnell was cheating on Lewis with a man named Ike, and Lewis had found out about it. Kenny and Espino looked at each other. This information lined up exactly with that letter they had found at the scene. Lorraine said after she had left Linnell's, she had gone to a nearby park, and there she just waited to hear from Linnell. But by early evening, she still had not heard, and she was starting to get worried. So around 6:45 p.m., she went back to Linnell's to make sure her friend was okay, and that's when she found Linnell's body. As Lorraine told this part of the story, her calm affect changed and she became much more emotional. Lorraine looked down at her stained clothes and just began to cry. Detective Kenny pushed a box of tissues across the table. He felt for Lorraine because no matter what, it was a trauma she would carry for the rest of her life to have found her friend dead. But there was one thing about her story that just kind of didn't sit right, and that was Lorraine's claim that she had been sitting in the park for 5 hours, just waiting for her friend to call her back or text her. Kenny wasn't sure he believed that. It had been very hot out all day, almost 90 degrees, and that whole time, Lorraine is just sitting on a bench, people watching, waiting for Linnell the whole time? It just seemed sort of unrealistic. But that was her story, and she hadn't changed it once. And anyways, the crime itself did really seem like textbook domestic violence, and Linnell's boyfriend Lewis was acting like a man with a very guilty conscience. But regardless, at this point, it was obvious to Kenny that Lorraine was no longer in any condition to answer any more questions, so they would just have to talk to her again later. And so he and Detective Espino told Lorraine she could go. And then, when the detectives stepped out of the interview room, an officer was waiting for them. The boyfriend, Louis Bonaire, had arrived. Now, Louis still had not been told what happened to Linnell, like he didn't know she was dead. And suspiciously, he had not asked anybody why he had been summoned to the sheriff's department. And he still didn't ask when detectives Kenny and Espino sat down across from him in an interrogation room. As soon as the door closed behind the detectives, they asked Louis about his relationship with Linnell. And right away, Louis launched into a story about Linnell that, as far as Kenny could tell, was full of lies. Louis said he and Linnell had a great relationship and were deeply in love. He said they'd had a couple of minor fights, but nothing that would lead to a breakup. Just normal relationship stuff. And, he said, neither of them was seeing anyone else. Both Kenny and Espino knew this was false, not just because of the letter they found and the things that Lorraine and Bobby had told them, but because they had checked the police record of calls to Linnell and Louis's home and found that at least twice, officers had been called to break up a domestic disturbance that started because Linnell was speaking to another man. The detectives asked Louis to walk them through everything he did on June 16th, the day Linnell was murdered. Louis admitted that he and Linnell had gotten into a fight that morning because he'd found Linnell's secret cell phone. He also admitted to following Linnell and Lorraine around town, trying to get answers from his girlfriend about why she was using this secret phone. But Louis said they had only fought until about 12:40 p.m. At that point, he said he had gone to LA and gotten his truck repaired by Lorraine's boyfriend. He said he'd gotten to Lorraine's boyfriend's place around 2 p.m. and then spent the rest of the day going to auto supply shops in the area to buy car parts. And then after that, around 6 p.m., he'd arrived at Linnell's mother's house for the night. And while Louis was sitting there telling the detectives this very far-fetched story, all the detectives could think about was the long, thin scratch on the side of Louis's face. When Louis finished his story about what he'd done the day before, Detective Espino asked him about the scratch. And this kicked up a whole nother story by Louis. He talked fast, explaining that Linnell had scratched him a few days ago, but he just said it was a misunderstanding. However, the detectives did not buy it. And so Kenny decided it was time to go on the offensive. He had a folder in front of him, and from it, he took out the letter that police had found at Linnell and Louis's home that said Linnell was breaking up with Louis to go be with her other boyfriend, Ike. And Kenny slid that letter across the table to Louis, and then sat back silently while Louis read it. Now, Kenny was expecting Louis to read this letter with some level of recognition, and then after that, he would likely crumble. After all, Louis had just sat here lying to their faces for a full half hour, and now they were showing him that they had known he was lying to them the whole time. I mean, if nothing else, it was clear they were not in a loving relationship, and his girlfriend was seeing other people. Kenny actually wondered if, when confronted with this letter, if Louis might actually just confess right then and there. But instead, after Louis finished reading it, he just frowned and looked up in confusion and said he had never seen it before. He did admit that he knew who Ike was, but he said that, Linnell and Ike were just friends. Kenny had to stop himself from shaking his head in disgust. These lies were shameless, and he couldn't stand to listen to them anymore. So he leaned across the table, and he told Louis the real reason he had been brought to this interview room. The letter, he said, had been found at his house, and his girlfriend, Linnell, had been murdered. At this, Louis did lose his composure. He started stammering incoherently, and then broke down into hysterical sobs. Detectives Kenny and Espino just watched him for a minute. They didn't feel sorry for him at all. All they actually thought was, this guy is a really good actor. Without waiting for him to stop crying, they told him they were going to need his fingerprints and samples of his DNA. And then they dropped one final bombshell. They said they were going to continue their investigation into Linnell's murder, but Louis was not leaving the sheriff's department. Between the record of domestic disturbances, the scratch on his face, the huge fight the day of the murder, his lies during the interview, and his so far unconfirmed alibi, the detectives told Lewis they had enough to arrest him on suspicion of murder. The detectives left the interrogation room as a crime tech went in to collect Lewis's DNA samples, and a uniformed police officer stood by to start the booking procedure as soon as they were done. The detectives were not even one full day into their investigation, and they already had taken a suspect into custody. And so they were both feeling pretty good and very much like they needed to take a break for at least a few hours and go get some sleep. However, as they walked back into the lobby, they saw a woman with a puffy, tear-streaked face walk in the door, looking lost and bewildered. At the same time, the detectives realized this had to be Bobby Barsock, Linnell's mother, and so sleep would have to wait. They ushered Bobby into a private room and got all three of them cups of coffee. What Kenny and Espino needed from Bobby, first and foremost, was a timeline of the evening of the murder, because Bobby was part of Lewis's alibi. So, as they sipped their coffee, they asked her to walk them through what happened when Lewis showed up, what time, what he said, everything. In a shaky voice, Bobby said Lewis had gotten to her house a little after 6 p.m. She was sure of the time because Family Feud had just started on TV when he walked in the door. Kenny furrowed his eyebrows. This was exactly what Lewis had said, which was a little disappointing because if Lewis had lied about when he got to Bobby's house, it would have made the case simpler. Still, though, this detail didn't mean Lewis was innocent. Linnell had to have been killed sometime between about 12:30 p.m. after she got home from the beauty store and 6:45 p.m. when Lorraine discovered her body. It would have taken Lewis about an hour and a half to drive from Palmdale to Bobby's house, which meant that to arrive by 6, he had to leave no later than about 4:30 p.m. So, Bobby's timeline left Lewis approximately 3 to 4 hours before he had left, when he claimed he was just walking around shopping for car parts, but he actually could have been killing Linnell. But before Detective Kenny could follow that thought any further, Bobby told the detectives that there was something important she had to show them. It was part of the reason she had driven all the way up here. She pulled out her phone, and the detectives leaned forward to look. On the screen, she pulled up a text message. It was from Linnell's other boyfriend, Ike. On the night of the murder, Ike had messaged Bobby to say he spoke to Linnell that day and she sounded scared. He said he was worried that Lewis was going to hurt her. As Bobby put her phone away, Kenny thought that message made Lewis look really bad. However, Kenny was a veteran homicide detective, and he knew that finding a killer was as much about ruling the right suspect in as it was about ruling the wrong suspects out. The victim's romantic partner was almost always the first suspect, but in this case, Linnell had two of them. Lewis and Ike were both part of this love triangle, so by default, they were both suspects. To prove that Lewis was guilty, the detectives also needed to prove that Ike was innocent. After speaking with Linnell's mother, detectives Kenny and Espino had both been awake for more than 24 hours, so they decided to get some sleep. Then they regrouped on the afternoon of June 17th, the day after the murder. Their case was moving fast. Linnell's boyfriend Lewis was in custody, and they were hoping the evidence would continue to line up and continue to point straight at him. But Linnell was living a more complicated life than it looked like from the outside, and now they needed to rule her second boyfriend, Ike, out as a suspect. So their first step when they returned to the sheriff's department was to track Ike down, and because Bobby had given them his number, it wasn't that difficult. They just called him up on the phone. Ike's full name was Ike Umuna, and he lived in Northern California. And he readily admitted to having a relationship with Linnell, and he said he had given her that secret cell phone because Lewis was unpredictable and scary. When Kenny told Ike that Linnell was dead, Ike broke down. This was exactly what he said he'd been afraid of when he had texted Linnell's mom. Ike said he had an alibi for the entire day of the murder. He said he had been at a job interview at the University of California, Davis, which was a 6-hour drive from Palmdale. And this was exactly the kind of thing Kenny had hoped to hear. Because if this was true, then Kenny knew it was not physically possible for Ike to have killed Linnell himself. That didn't mean he hadn't hired a hitman, but to Kenny, the crime scene looked like a murder committed by an amateur, not a professional. Yes, Linnell had been shot in the back of the head, which was sort of execution style and maybe hitman style, but the bloody, messy scene suggested a level of panic after the fact that didn't make sense for a stranger killing for money. So it was looking very likely that they would be able to rule Ike out as a suspect. Kenny told Ike they would be in touch, and then he hung up the phone. Kenny and Espino looked at each other. They would run down both boyfriends' alibis at the same time, and whoever's didn't check out was very likely their murderer. Now, the breakneck pace of the investigation slowed, as Kenny and Espino began the painstaking work of finding every person that Lewis and Ike mentioned interacting with on the day of the murder. Both detectives were leaning towards Lewis as their guy, and initially, their interviews seemed to confirm their suspicions, ruling Ike out and ruling Lewis in. Ike's alibi was basically airtight. Administrators at the University of California, Davis confirmed that he had been there right in the middle of the day, which meant he definitely was not in Palmdale. And as the detectives talked to more of Linnell's friends, Ike's warning about Lewis's violence started to look less extraordinary. Because basically everyone in Linnell's life seemed to have been worried about her relationship with Lewis. But as the days went by, and Kenny and Espino leaned into tracking each and every one of Lewis's movements on the day of the murder, they found something surprising. Lewis's alibi also checked out. The detectives searched Lewis's truck and found receipts from June 16th, which was the day of the murder. Lewis had claimed he was shopping for car parts that afternoon, but the detectives had not believed him. However, the receipts showed that he was in fact near LA, an hour and a half away from Palmdale, starting a little before 3 p.m. And so suddenly, the window of time that Lewis had to murder Linnell shrunk from around 3 or 4 hours to only about 1 hour. Of course, it was still possible that he killed Linnell in that hour, but when the detectives pulled surveillance footage from the auto shops, they saw Lewis walking calmly through the aisles and paying at the registers. There was no blood, no nervous behavior that would suggest he had just shot and killed his girlfriend. But the final blow to their case against Lewis came when Kenny and Espino tracked down Lorraine's boyfriend, who was the one who actually worked on Lewis's car. He told them that on the day of the murder, Lewis had shown up at his house in LA at 2 p.m. This meant that Lewis had apparently been telling the truth when he said he left his house at 12:40 p.m., which meant Lewis could not have killed Linnell. So, in the middle of July, 1 month after Kenny and Espino had picked up what they thought would be an open and shut murder case, they were forced to release their primary suspect, Lewis, from jail. Now, they were back to square one. Detectives Kenny and Espino could have just waited for the forensic evidence to come back. The crime scene techs had collected so much DNA evidence that it had taken multiple days to process the scene, and would take months to return results. But whoever had killed Linnell had tried and failed to clean it up, and in the process had left fingerprints and maybe even their own DNA behind. But there was something bothering both of the detectives about the timeline they'd spent weeks constructing so methodically. They had a precise chronology of the movements of Linnell, Lorraine, Bobby, Lewis, and Ike, as well as all of Linnell's friends and family, but the only thing this chronology really showed was that no one had been able to kill Linnell. So somebody was lying. They just didn't know who. Now, the detectives had already pulled Linnell's phone records from the day she was killed, but now they decided to get new search warrants. They didn't just want suspect and victim phone records anymore. They wanted to know who their witnesses had spoken to, too. It would take the detectives about 4 months to get their hands on all the records they needed, but when they did, everything suddenly made sense. It turned out that Linnell had been keeping one more secret that Kenny and Espino had not been able to uncover, until they discovered a single phone call made at 4:44 p.m. on the day of the murder that explained everything. Based on evidence collected by investigators, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linnell Barsock on June 16, 2010. That afternoon, sometime before 4 p.m., the killer stood in the living room at Linnell's house, right behind Linnell, staring at the back of her head. Even though they both had moved on from the fight earlier in the day, the killer could tell Linnell was still upset. But truthfully, they weren't really concerned about how Linnell felt. Linnell had so much: a great personality, a loving family, a growing career. But the killer only had Linnell, who they still had deep feelings for. And now that Linnell didn't want them, they decided Linnell shouldn't have anything. Slowly and silently, the killer lifted the gun they had brought with them, aimed it at the back of Linnell's head, and pulled the trigger. Linnell immediately slumped to the floor, and seconds later, blood was pooling all around her. Step 1 of the plan was complete. Now, the killer just had to clean up, and then after that, they would drive to the desert where they would bury her body and everything that had blood on it. They quickly wrapped Linnell's head in a plastic bag to keep more blood from spreading. Then they dragged Linnell to the garage where the car was. After that, the killer sopped up all the blood in the living room with towels, and so far it seemed like everything was going great. Soon the floor was clean. But then, at 4:44 p.m., they heard their phone ring. And on the other end was a person who had some bad news. Somebody was on their way to the house. The killer knew if they didn't hurry, they'd be caught. This made the killer panic, and instead of finishing the cleanup, they decided to make sure that the evidence left behind didn't lead to them, but to somebody else. So they quickly wrote a fake letter and left that behind. Then they ran out of the house, got in their car, and sped off to the sheriff's department to report the crime they had just committed. Because the killer was Linnell's so-called close friend, Lorraine Austin. She executed her friend in cold blood while she was standing right behind her doing her hair. It would turn out these two women were not just friends. They actually had a romantic relationship that they both had kept a secret. They had met online just a month earlier and briefly dated. However, 5 days before her murder, Linnell suggested they just be friends. And Lorraine had been devastated, because not only was she in love with Linnell, she also wanted to be Linnell. Lorraine was extremely jealous of her. Linnell had a career, she had a big house, while Lorraine was in debt and living at her mom's place. And so being dumped by her made her bitter and furious. Lorraine's phone records revealed her romantic relationship with Linnell and their breakup. And most critically, the records also showed what interrupted Lorraine while she was cleaning up the crime scene. It was a phone call from her boyfriend, the same one who had been with Lewis all afternoon fixing his truck. The boyfriend told her that Lewis had just left, and that made Lorraine think Lewis was coming home, when in reality, Lewis was going to Linnell's mother's house for the night. But since Lorraine thought he'd be there soon, she pivoted from cleaning up the crime scene to framing Lewis. When the forensic evidence was finally processed, it revealed Lorraine's DNA and fingerprints at the scene, but that was to be expected because she was friends with Linnell. However, her DNA and fingerprints were found in areas that tied her directly to the crime. By the time police solved the case, Lorraine had gone on the run. She wasn't captured until a year and a half after the murder, after authorities put the case on America's Most Wanted, and a tipster spotted her in Belize. Lorraine Austin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive 25 years to life prison terms. She'll be eligible for parole in 2032.
Early on the morning of January 12, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Portufis sat up suddenly in his bed, breathing hard. The room was pitch black that he was in, but he could feel he was sweating and his heart was racing, and he tried to shake his head to kind of wipe the nightmare he had just had from his mind, but he just couldn't do it. All he could think about was how in this nightmare, something had been chasing him, and he had been running for his life, and he was trying to get away, but whatever this thing was, this horrible beast that was following him, it just kept getting closer and closer and closer until it finally got him, and that's what woke him up. Jacques reached up and touched his face, and he realized he was crying, and he quickly wiped the tears away because he didn't want any of his brothers or sisters to see that he was crying. Jacques was the oldest of 8 kids in his family, and all of them slept in the same small room on straw-filled mattresses inside of their family's little cottage in the southern French province of Gévaudan. And so, Jacques, he's looking around the bedroom to make sure none of his siblings had woken up and seen him in this state, and he was relieved to see that they were all still fast asleep. Everybody made fun of Jacques for being a scaredy cat, for being a coward. And to Jacques, this really hurt his feelings because on some level, he knew it was kind of true. In fact, just a couple of months earlier, he had lost in a physical fight with a much younger boy, and afterwards, Jacques had cried. And the whole town had seen this happen, and so afterward, all the kids began calling Jacques the wet chicken, and even Jacques' brothers and sisters began joining in and calling him the wet chicken and really making him feel totally ashamed. And it wasn't like the adults in this village were stepping up and protecting Jacques, because to them, Jacques was kind of like a liability. In this part of France, the winters were brutal. People died all the time in this village from the weather. And then the summers brought all these outbreaks of disease, which wiped out even more people in this village. And so by and large, where Jacques lived, it was kind of like the survival of the fittest, and many kids didn't live that long unless they were really hardy and tough, like their parents, who had managed to survive for that long. But Jacques was just not like that. He was very gentle and peaceful, yet somehow he had survived. And Jacques really was not trying to become this kind of macho guy. Instead, he really wanted to be a priest, like his uncle. But his uncle lived far away, and so it was tough to see his uncle all that often, to learn about, how to become a priest. But anytime Jacques did get a chance to actually see his uncle, he would have a chance to read all these books and study alongside his uncle. And so for a little while, it was like Jacques was transported away from the hardships of his village to the life that in many ways he wished he had. A quiet, peaceful, very studious life. But deep down, Jacques felt like there was no chance he would ever actually escape this little village where he effectively was an outcast. Even though the sun had not risen yet, Jacques just sat on his bed and couldn't fall asleep again after waking up from this nightmare. And so just sitting there in the dark and the quiet, Jacques began to think about what he had to do later that day when the sun did come up. And, like usual, Jacques started to feel afraid. And so Jacques eventually just laid down with his eyes open, and he laid there until dawn, when one of his younger brothers, named Jean, who was 8 years old, rolled over and pushed him and said, "Hey, wet chicken, it's time to get up. It's our day with the sheep. Let's go." Jacques scowled at his younger brother and shoved him back, but not that hard, because Jacques never really shoved anybody that hard, no matter what they did to him. And then both boys hopped out of their bed. They wolfed down some bread and cheese and then headed out the door. As soon as they were outside, Jacques noticed that the village was much quieter than it normally was. But then again, these days, villagers did not leave their homes unless they absolutely had to. And so Jacques and Jean made their way away from their cottage down the dirt road to the pen where their family kept all of their sheep. And the boys opened up the gate and then used their staffs to kind of corral the sheep out of the gate back onto the road. And as the sheep kind of bleated and baaed and bumped into each other, the boys worked hard to kind of organize them on the road. And then once the sheep understood which direction they were going, towards the forest, a very familiar walk for the sheep, they kind of fell into line and just began walking very casually, like they knew exactly where to go. And once the sheep had fallen into this kind of routine rhythm, Jacques and Jean fell in behind them and just walked quietly after them. And as the boys walked, they both constantly kept looking left and right and ahead of the sheep and behind them, constantly scanning for danger, because they knew something was out here. For months now, children all across this province in France, Gévaudan, had been going missing. They'd go off into fields or pastures, like when they're moving their family's livestock around, and the kids would just vanish. And then sometimes, if they were found again, they'd be found totally mutilated far from where they should have been. The attacks on these kids across Gévaudan had begun a year earlier on June 30th, 1764. On that day, a 14-year-old girl, who actually was the older sister of one of Jacques' friends, had disappeared and then been found again later that day, partially eaten in a field near her home after she had not come home with the family's cattle. Now, of course, this was very tragic, but to this point, there had not been any other attacks, so there was no pattern here, and so the assumption was she must have been attacked by a wolf, which did happen, and often two children, because kids at this time in France were often in charge of tending to their family's grazing animals, the way Jacques and Jean were going out with their sheep. These kids were small, they couldn't really defend themselves, and if a wolf set onto them, there was very little they could do. But 5 weeks after this 14-year-old girl was found dead and mutilated in the field, 2 more teenagers were also found mutilated and dead in a field. And really, this was only the beginning. As summer turned to fall that year, more and more kids went missing and then turned up dead in fields, partially mutilated. And the more these attacks happened across southern France, the more people thought to themselves, this can't be a wolf. Number one, wolves don't go on extended human killing sprees. That's just not a thing. And number two, if it was a wolf, they would be eating more of their victims. They wouldn't just rip their body to shreds and then leave them. They would eat the meat. And so by this early January day in 1765, as Jacques and Jean were setting out for the day with their family's sheep, the death toll from whatever was killing these kids was now well into the dozens. People in France had begun calling whatever was killing these children the Beast of Gévaudan, and stories about this creature began popping up in newspapers all over France. People all across southern France began forming these huge hunting parties to go out into the forests and the wilds of Gévaudan to find this creature and kill it, but they would always come back empty-handed. And then every now and again, a hunter would be out and they would see a huge wolf and they would kill it and they would declare that they had found and killed the Beast of Gévaudan. But the attacks on these kids all across this province just continued. So obviously that wolf was not it. And so as these attacks continued, all the fairs and festivals that normally would pop up all year long all across southern France, those all stopped because people were afraid to go out in fear of this creature. And then of course, in villages like Jacques' village, people really just stopped going out unless they had to, again, because of the Beast of Gévaudan. But Jacques and Jean's family relied on their livestock and they needed their sheep to go out and graze. And so, on this day in January, Jacques and Jean had to go out because their sheep had to graze. Their family relied on the sheep, livestock was their livelihood, and so this was a mandatory thing. And so, as Jacques and Jean continued walking behind their herd of sheep down this dirt road towards the forest, the two boys eventually came to a stop and just turned around and looked back at their village. And they saw, walking on the road towards them, were 5 more kids, along with 2 additional herds of sheep that these 5 kids were in charge of. Ever since the Beast of Gévaudan had become a thing, Jacques and Jean had begun tending their sheep along with these 5 kids and their sheep. They figured the bigger their group was, the safer they were from this creature. As the 5 kids got closer to Jacques and Jean, Jacques realized that one of the kids that was with them this day was a tall, thin redhead. It was the same younger boy who had recently beaten Jacques up in front of the village, and he had cried and everyone had made fun of him. And so Jacques sees this kid coming, and immediately he can feel his face burning with embarrassment. And then the boy, he sees Jacques, and he immediately smirks and begins flapping his arms like chicken wings. But once these 5 kids and their sheep joined Jacques and Jean and their sheep, they all kind of just went quiet, because none of them wanted to be out there. They were all scared of the Beast of Gévaudan, and the only reason they were together was, again, to be safe from this creature that was killing kids left and right. And so, in relative silence, all of the kids and their sheep just slowly walked together down this dirt path, and eventually they made it into the big forest, where just beyond the forest was the pasture where these sheep would graze. And as the group actually entered into the trees and it became dark and more quiet and kind of eerie, Jean actually tugged on Jacques' shoulder and said, "Will you please tell a story?" Because Jean was scared too. The kids were all scared, and they figured, if Jacques just told a story, it would take their mind off of how tense this moment was. And when Jacques heard this request, he actually smiled, because this was something he loved to do. He was a great storyteller. It was like his one strength. When Jean had asked for the story, the kids and the sheep had actually made it to really the end of the forest path. And so by the time Jacques was about to start his story, all the sheep had made their way out of the forest onto this big open pasture right in the middle of the forest. And so as the sheep just kind of filtered out into this open area, Jacques stopped and all the kids kind of came up right behind him. And Jacques started his story by pointing across the pasture to this bog that was right at the base of this big hill. And he said, "Do you see those big rocks in that bog over there? Well, you see the biggest rock? Well, that's not really a rock. It's actually a doorway. And if you move the rock underneath it, there's a portal to another world." And so as Jacques began telling this very creative story about this kingdom that existed underneath the bog, he sat down against a rock, kind of facing out towards the sheep, and all the other kids kind of filed in around him, taking seats, with Jean, his brother, sitting right behind him to his right. And Jacques, he was just really into the story to the point where he kind of forgot about what was happening with the sheep, and he wasn't scanning around for danger, and neither were any of the kids, including the redhead who had beaten Jacques up. He wanted to act like he wasn't into his story, but in reality, he totally was, and he was just as interested in what was going on with the magical kingdom below this rock. And finally, when Jacques got to the end of his story, where this evil giant that had been tormenting the kingdom under the bog had been tricked by an orphan to try to go through this magical portal into their world, and the giant had gotten stuck in the doorway because he was so big, and he never tormented the kingdom again, and they lived happily ever after. When Jacques got to that point in the story and all the kids are totally locked in and not paying attention to anything else, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was, even though Jacques is telling the story and focusing on that, in the back of his mind, he registers hearing the sound of twigs breaking somewhere right behind him, almost like the sound of someone or something moving along the forest floor. And the second thing that happened was the red-headed kid who had beaten up Jacques, without saying a word, just stood up and began sprinting towards the pasture. And for a moment, Jacques thought this kid, who was kind of like a bully, was doing this on purpose, to be rude to Jacques, to kind of run away at the climax of the story like he didn't care about it. But then Jacques realized that he smelled something terrible behind him. But when Jacques turned around to see what was making this smell, he saw that his brother, Jean, who had been sitting right behind him to his right, was now gone, and where he had been sitting was just his staff laying on the ground. And for a second, Jacques just couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. He didn't understand how his brother could have gotten away from him without him noticing. But before Jacques could do anything, all the kids around him that were still there began screaming and pointing up towards this hill that was right behind them. And so Jacques turned around, and to his horror, he saw there was this huge 12-foot tall creature that was covered in fur. It looked like an oversized wolf, but it was standing on two legs, and its bones seemed like they were too big for its own skin, and it made it seem very angular and jagged. And as it kind of loped grotesquely up the hillside, Jacques realized it was carrying in its front arm Jean, who was screaming and kicking but could not get away from this creature. Jacques understood that this was the beast of Gévaudan, and it was going to go kill his brother. And immediately, Jacques is thinking, you gotta run away, get to safety, get out of here. And all the kids around him, that's what they did. They took off running towards the pasture. They didn't care about Jean, they only cared about themselves. And so Jacques, he knows he needs to get away, save himself, but his legs just will not move. He is rooted to the spot because something inside of him told him he has to save his brother. It doesn't matter if everyone thinks he's a coward. That's his brother. He needs to do something. And so Jacques, he turns to the kids who are running away from him, and he screams at them to stop, come back. And the kids were so surprised to hear this strong, authoritative voice coming out of the wet chicken that they did stop and turned around to see what he wanted. And he said, get over here, I have a plan. And so the kids, with the exception of the redhead who had run off by himself, they came back to Jacques, and Jacques began telling them his plan to save Jean. And the kids, again, were so taken with how Jacques was really owning this moment and being a leader that they all said, okay, let's do this. And so after this very quick planning meeting, all the kids turned and began running up the hillside towards the beast of Gévaudan, with Jacques in the front with his staff out. And the kids gained on the beast really quickly, and the creature clearly noticed and kept turning around and kept looking at these kids getting closer and closer, but the beast did not seem interested in any of them. It just wanted Jean. And in fact, it moved Jean from its arm up into its mouth, and then the creature began kind of using the trees to pull itself faster and faster away from the kids. But Jacques, he just kept going faster and faster and pushing himself to get closer and closer, and as he did, it motivated the other kids to follow along and push it and gain on this creature. And finally, they got close enough to this beast that Jacques yelled out to the kids, now! And they all fanned out around it and began smashing this beast with their staffs they used to shepherd their livestock. Now, none of their blows to this creature were doing any real damage, and the creature did not really seem fazed that the kids were now attacking it, but they were kind of able, with their strikes to this creature, to direct it and get it to kind of turn in the direction that Jacques had told them to make the creature go. And so the kids continued to beat and poke and corral this creature, and every time they'd hit it, the beast would kind of flail out with one of its arms, but it never really did anything because, again, it's really focused, obviously, on taking Jean. But eventually, Jacques' plan worked. He had corralled the creature to the top of the hillside, right over where that bog was, where those rocks in the middle were part of the story that Jacques had told about how there was this portal to another world. And once this creature was positioned where Jacques wanted it, he again yelled to the kids to do the next phase of their plan. And all the kids kind of fanned out to the top of the hill, and with their staffs, they beat and poked this creature down the hill into the bog. And as they did this, Jacques kept looking to see if Jean was alive, because earlier he had been screaming and kicking, but now there was blood all over his brother and he was limp in the creature's mouth and he wasn't making any sound. But Jacques didn't care. He wanted to get his brother back, dead or alive. And so finally, Jacques stepped forward from the group and he wound up and he smashed the beast as hard as he could, hard enough that the beast actually kind of stumbled forward into the actual marshy bog. And what Jacques knew about this bog and why he had come up with that particular story about there being a gateway to another world is weeks earlier, he had actually accidentally stepped into this bog and saw it was really deep. And he had been lucky enough that he had grabbed a rock and kind of pulled himself out, because if he hadn't, the bog kind of functioned like quicksand. You could get stuck in the bog and never get out again. And this is what happened to the beast of Gévaudan. It went feet first into the one spot of the bog that Jacques had had all the kids corral it to, that was the deepest and most dangerous part. And as soon as the beast stepped into it, it sunk down to its waist. And immediately the beast reached out with its huge muscular arms and tried to pull itself out of the bog, but it couldn't. It was stuck. And so in its panic, it let go of Jean from its mouth, and it actually turned around and it looked at Jacques and the other kids. And when it did, Jacques almost lost his nerve, because when he saw this thing face to face up close, he saw this was not a wolf's face. This was almost like a human face. Its eyes were making distinct eye contact with Jacques, and it was furious. It was like the beast understood that Jacques had just trapped it. He had tricked the beast into walking into this bog, and it wanted to kill Jacques. And for a moment, Jacques was totally entranced by this creature's eyes. It just struck him that this looks human. It looks intelligent. What is this thing? And while Jacques was kind of in this daze, the creature reached forward and slashed his stomach wide open. And Jacques fell backwards on the ground, but luckily he was far enough away from the beast that he couldn't be pulled back in. And in this kind of frantic moment, one of the other kids saw an opportunity and ran forward, grabbed Jean, who was laying on the surface of the bog, and he pulled him away from the beast. And the beast whipped around. He tried to grab Jean, but he couldn't. And so all of a sudden, all these kids were safely away from the beast of Gévaudan, who was totally trapped. And so at this point, the other kids who were not hurt, they scooped up Jacques and they scooped up Jean, and they began running away from the bog across the pasture back towards the village, leaving the beast where it was. And as they ran, they heard it bellowing out and roaring and trying to pull itself out, but it still just remained in the bog. And finally, as they got back to that dirt path that led back to the village, they saw there was a group of armed villagers running towards them, because it would turn out the redhead who had ran off, he had told the village, and they were coming out to help the kids. And so as the armed villagers met with the kids, they told them where the beast was, stuck in that bog, and the villagers took off to go kill the beast. And then the kids, along with Jacques and Jean, they went into the village. They were put into a home and put on beds, by which point the village doctor had come over and began treating both of them. Jean was alive, but just barely. He had lost a lot of blood, and the beast had grabbed onto his scalp and really crushed his skull, but he would ultimately survive. As for Jacques, it was a very painful wound that he had sustained on his stomach, but none of his internal organs had been damaged, and so he would also survive as well. As for the armed villagers, even though they very quickly got out to that bog where the beast was, when they got there, the beast was gone. And the beast of Gévaudan would continue to kill people for another 2 years, until June 19th, 1767, when a hunter happened to encounter it in the middle of a forest, and he shot and killed it. And by that point, over 100 people had been murdered by this creature. The hunter would drag the carcass of the beast back into his village, and a doctor would perform an autopsy, but the doctor was unable to identify what kind of animal it was. It did kind of look like a wolf, a really huge wolf, but its body was just so misshapen and its bones were too big, and it clearly walked on two legs, not on all fours, and so there was never any definitive information about what this even was and how this even happened. But when they opened up its stomach, they did find human body parts. Jacques was one of the only people to have ever survived an encounter with the beast of Gévaudan, and so he was celebrated all across France. And he quickly went from being the wet chicken to the little hero, and his story would reach as far away as Boston, Massachusetts. And in fact, Jacques' story was so well publicized that it eventually reached King Louis XV, and he was so moved by it that he invited Jacques to come meet him, and after meeting Jacques, he loved him and offered to pay for his entire education. And so Jacques would get to finally leave this little village where he never quite fit in, and he would move to northern France and enroll in a prestigious school there, and he would spend his days reading and writing just like he had always hoped for.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen's podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song